good. Well, thank you, Mike. It's a tremendous opportunity to talk to you guys this morning. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I think it is an absolutely stunning use of technology to be able to speak to you guys, multiple campuses at the same time. So I have a lot of slides here, so I don't want to waste a whole lot of time talking. But I do, again, want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. We've gotten to that time of the year where the weather can be rather intense. We got a nice example of that over the past couple of days where we had to worry about large hail damaging winds, maybe even tornadoes and stuff like that. That is springtime in Texoma. And when it comes to springtime in Texoma, there is good news and there is bad news. Now, the good news is obviously we get the much needed rainfall to keep the grass growing and allow the flowers to bloom and the trees to bloom. And springtime can often be a very beautiful time here, a very comfortable time here in Texoma. We're going to get a perfect example of that as we get into this weekend. But what I want to talk about is what we've experienced here over the last couple of days when we had those strong to severe thunderstorms. If you look at this particular slide here, you see those images at the top. We saw quite a bit of that in our skies over the past couple of days. So we're going to talk about the goods and the bads. I'm going to start with the bad news, and I'm going to follow up with the good news. When it comes to large hail, tornadoes, stuff like that, we're kind of in a geographical hotspot. What I mean by that, here where Texas and Oklahoma come together, that we call Texoma, there's a rather high frequency. There's a lot of thunderstorm events where we might have to deal with large hail and damaging winds. That image, the picture you see there at the bottom right, that is a softball-size hail. Now, hail doesn't always get that big, it rarely ever gets that big, but we did have an event down in Seymour, I believe, back in 2004, March of 2004, where there was widespread softball and baseball-sized hail, and it did significant damage to cars and trucks. We also talk about tornadoes, and again, you can see on this map, I placed a star where Wichita Falls is, and you can see, again, we're kind of in a hot spot where there's a high number of tornadoes every spring in Texas and in Oklahoma. Another way to look at that is you look at the top 5 states when it comes to the total numbers of tornadoes every year, and Texas, Oklahoma lead the pack. And when it comes to the number of tornadoes that have caused deaths and people to be killed, again, Texas and Oklahoma leads the pack. So we have to be very mindful of any threat that comes our way from bad storms. Now, if you talk to anyone who's, say, 45 years or older, they could tell you some stories about April 10th, 1979. It's what Wichitans referred to as Terrible Tuesday. Also, folks in Vernon and Lawton. There were multiple Texoma towns that were hit by tornadoes just that one night, April 10th, 1979. This map is kind of hard to read, but if you look at it closely, you can actually see the paths that tornadoes took on that night. Three of those large tornadoes crossed the Red River, and keep that in mind because I'm actually going to address that here in just a little bit. The Wichita Falls tornado back in April 10th of 79, what we call Terrible Tuesday, it killed 45 people. It injured over 1,000 people. The most amazing number on this entire slide here is that the Wichita Falls tornado displaced, another way to say that would be left homeless, over 20,000 people. That's nearly a quarter. Yeah, Mike says he was one of them. If you ever get a chance to talk to Mike about his April 10th, 1979 experience, please let him have that discussion with you. If it hadn't been for Wichita Falls, the headlines would have come from Vernon, where 10 people were killed, probably 100 plus injured. Also, Lawton was hit by a tornado that night as well. On this particular slide, we see the path of the Wichita Falls tornado. It cut a swath a mile wide in some spots, and it went from the southwest side of the city near Memorial Stadium to across the Henry S. Grace Freeway and to the east of downtown. It was one of the costliest tornadoes in American history. Now, in the past 20 years or so, we've had some more expensive tornadoes, namely Joplin and a few in Alabama. It was rated an F4 by the National Weather Service. The damage in Wichita Falls was actually surveyed by the man for who the Fujita scale is named, or the F scale, now the EF scale, and that was Dr. Ted Fujita. When he arrived in Wichita Falls, he said he hadn't seen anything like the damage since he surveyed Xenia, Ohio, which was back in 1974, I believe. And I believe the Wichita Falls tornado still stands as the 5th deadliest tornado in Texas history. More bad news is myths being passed as truth. For example, some small towns are protected by rivers or mountains. It's possible that many of you have been up in Medicine Park, Oklahoma, nestled there in the Wichita Mountains. You would think if there was any spot in Texoma protected by mountains, it would be Medicine Park. But in, I think, Valentine's Day of 1987, Medicine Park was hit by a tornado, and I want to say that tornado did $1 million worth of damage. Strangely enough, that was the day that a lot of the area storm spotters went up to Norman to do their spotter training. As a result of that happening, now the National Weather Service comes to us to do storm spotter training instead of having the spotters go up there to Norman. Another myth is that overpasses are safe shelters from tornadoes. A lot of that myth actually has a direct connection to Wichita Falls in 1979 because some news camera crews actually got the account of a man who claimed to have survived the Wichita Falls tornado by hiding under the overpass, which I think is at Midwestern Parkway and Henry S. Grace. I think that's where he claimed that he survived the storm. You don't hear this myth a lot nowadays, but when I was a kid, we often heard the people say that if you opened your windows prior to a tornado coming, it would prevent your home from exploding. Well, we got a little smart since then, and we realized that it was 200-mile-per-hour winds laden with your neighbor's trees and fences and cars. That's actually what does the damage to your vehicle, to your home. It's not the difference in pressure between the outside and the inside of your home. Okay, let me speak quickly about the good news, because I think the good news outweighs the bad. And the good news is the odds of ever being affected by a tornado are quite slim. Now, yes, the Wichita Falls tornado nearly 40 years ago, Mike, if you can believe that, was bad, and it affected tens of thousands of people. But the odds of that ever happening are actually quite slim. If I remained in this building for the remainder of my life, the chances that I would ever be struck by a tornado are about 1 in 10 million. So the odds are very, very poor that you or your life or your property will ever be affected by a significant tornado. The odds are greater that you'll be struck by lightning. That's about 1 in, 500,000. The chances are much, much greater that you could be in a very serious car accident. The odds of that are about 2 in 10,000. So there's a much greater risk that you could be injured, perhaps killed in a car accident, than ever be affected by a tornado. Now, more good news, again, if you stood one place on earth for the rest of your life, the odds that you would ever be affected by a tornado is less than 1%. So we're kind of getting into the math here, but what I'm trying to say is many of us will never be harmed by a tornado. More good news is that less than 2% of total tornadoes across the United States are what we would consider violent or doing extreme damage. If you look at the bottom right picture of the slide here, you see the results of a very violent tornado, a rare tornado that we would call an F5 or an EF5, one that has literally swept the foundation of a home clean. Those make up a very slim number of tornadoes. Most of them are very weak and very short-lived, and rarely do they do damage. I'm kind of going fast here, but I want to allow some time for discussion because I think that's more important than me just telling you numbers and what to do about it. More good news is that the technology and the forecasting is getting better every year. The average lead time for tornado warnings is 11 minutes. Now, granted, 11 minutes is a lot of time for able-bodied people to take shelter. But if I worked in a hospital and I was responsible for moving people who can't move on their own, they would need as much time as they could possibly get to get people to safe shelter. And also, we want to do our tornado drills and take our tornado precautions in schools. We want as much time as possible. Automated warning systems deliver bulletins instantaneously. The best way to say that is as soon as the National Weather Service issues a warning, that immediately gets on your television, your wireless device. It's just instantaneous. And also wireless devices, smartphones and whatnot, make it quite easy to monitor the weather. So it's very rare that you could ever be caught off guard by the weather unless you're just simply ignoring all the warning signs. Okay. I won't ask everyone to answer at once, but maybe just answer to yourself and see if the answer is correct. And the question is, what is the most important thing you can have when a tornado warning is issued? Maybe I'll let you think that over for 10 seconds or so. Do we want to prompt them?
Check in with Johnson City, City View. It was Johnson City View, and see if they can answer that for us. So, City View, can you hear us okay? You might unmute and just check in. With them.
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome.
Can you hear us?
Awesome. Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, we can. Yes. Absolutely, we can.
Okay, I'm going to let one of my students answer the question. Jay.
First aid kit?
He says first aid kit.
Well, I guess you need
Elizabeth?
to get up there.
That's a very
Can you hear me?
That's a very good answer.
Okay.
That is
Okay,
a very
another
good answer.
one?
That's a very good answer.
Answer I was looking for.
Answer I was looking for.
They also said maybe some water and a radio.
Yeah.
Okay.
A handheld radio, possibly.
You actually are providing me
You
the right
actually are
answer
providing me the
in
right
a different
answer
way.
in
My
a different
answer
way.
is more
My
general.
answer
So what I'm
is
going to
more
do is I'm
general.
going
So what I'm
to
going to do is
advance
I'm
to
going
the
to
slide,
advance to
and
the
we'll get the
slide,
answer, right?
And we'll get the answer, right?
So
A
the
plan.
answer is
So the answer
plan.
is a plan.
And let me elaborate that.
And let me elaborate
on that a little bit.
Elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay.
Okay.
City View, can you go ahead and
City, can you go ahead and mute?
Okay. All right, good. Okay, let me elaborate on a plan. And actually, the answers you provided me were just that, a plan. First aid kit, water, that type of stuff. But the reason I answer a plan is because my plan is going to be different from your plan. The plan for the school is going to be different from a plan from home. I often encourage adults and grown-ups and parents to do tornado drills at home, right? Because the home has different areas that could be considered safe If you don't have a storm cellar, if you don't have what they call a safe room, you might look for an interior closet, stuff like that, to take shelter in. Your home might be built a little bit differently from my home or your neighbor's home. Therefore, your safe spot might be in a different spot. Just like of all the campuses I'm speaking to you today, every building is probably a little bit different, and therefore the safe area is probably a little bit different. The method to getting to that safe area is a little bit different. The reason it's good to have a plan while the sun is shining is because if a tornado is bearing down on your neighborhood, that's the wrong time to make a plan, because you're going to be making a plan while you're scared, while you're panicked, and while you're in a hurry, and chances are you're probably going to make the wrong plan. Let me take this a little bit farther and say, if you live in a trailer home, a mobile home, or what we often call a manufactured home, your plan has to be to get out of there and go to a safe spot. So it's possible that you might actually have to leave before the bad weather gets there. It's that type of stuff. So we can discuss more about that in just a little bit, but I do want to get through these slides. How are we doing on time, Mike? Okay, good. I'm just going to touch quickly on what to do. And obviously, the great thing about schools here in Texoma is they have great personnel, great grown-ups that are always looking out for the student safety. And they have a plan to keep you safe in the event that threatening weather ever comes along. So they know all this stuff, really. I'm just kind of preaching to the choir, honestly. But stay alert. And again, it's so easy now with smartphones, with television, with wireless devices, computers, to stay alert and know that threatening weather is coming. Knowing the difference between a watch and a warning. Another way to say that would be knowing the difference between, say, a tornado watch and a tornado warning. A watch means that the conditions are favorable for severe thunderstorms to develop, severe thunderstorms that could produce tornadoes. Watches, tornado watches, severe thunderstorm watches are often issued while the sun is shining and the weather's actually quite nice. When a watch is issued, that's to tell you that we could be in for some pretty tough weather here over the next few hours. A warning is different. A warning means that severe weather is being observed by storm spotters or by radar, and now is the time to put your plan into action. Watch means the storms could come. A warning means the storms are here. We need to be careful. We need to take action. In the heat of a spring afternoon, you can actually see some telltale signs that storms could be on their way. One certain giveaway are these big clouds towering up into the sky. These clouds are some of the biggest things you'll see in one glance. These clouds tower up in the heat of the late afternoon. We might have steady south or southeast winds. I don't know that people pay much attention to barometric pressure anymore. If you're kind of a weather nerd like I am, it's something you might be of interest. Falling barometric pressure. A dew point. Dew point is really a different way of saying humidity. Values of 60 degrees plus. Again, let me talk a little bit more about the difference between watches versus warnings. As you can see here on this map, this is a tornado watch, and it covers a very large area. If I were just to guess, I would say, maybe 30, 35, 40 counties. A watch is typically in effect for 5 to 9 hours. There's no guarantees that storms will happen, but the forecasters are pretty confident that thunderstorms will develop where that watch has been issued, and some of those storms could produce some pretty bad weather. The sun could actually be shining when a watch is issued. And in the United States, severe thunderstorm and tornado watches are issued exclusively by the Storm Prediction Center. And incidentally, the Storm Prediction Center is actually located in Norman, Oklahoma, about a 2-hour drive from Wichita Falls. So this picture, you might find this picture relatable because this is often what we do when we're taking shelter from storms. When I did tornado drills as a student, when I was in elementary, junior high, all the way up through high school, we were asked to make ourselves as small as possible and cover our heads. It's very important that our heads be protected, and that can be done by simply folding your hands over your head. Put as many walls between you and the storm. Stay away from windows, because windows are the easiest way that debris and stuff that can hurt you will get into your home. The walls of your home might stand up okay, but stuff will be driven through the windows, and that could hurt you. So you always want to stay away from windows. Ideally, you want to get into a small interior space like a closet or a bathroom. Protect your head, and most importantly, wait for the all clear. Yes, it's kind of scary, the thought of getting into a shelter with some bad weather on the way. What's equally kind of scary is really not knowing when to come out of the shelter, because it could be quiet the whole time. Power could go out, stuff like that. So have a means to know that it's safe. That's a little more easily done with portable radios and smartphones and stuff like that. Two places you don't want to be: mobile homes or trailer homes, and cars, trucks, and vans. Now, we go out in the parking lot, and cars seem very heavy, very sturdy. It seems like they would stand up to any tremendous wind. But you look here in the picture on the right, and this is actually a photograph from April 10th, 1979. In the background is Sykes Center Mall, and in the foreground here are cars, passenger cars, that were a lot heavier back then than they are now, probably weighing, 4 or 5, I don't know how much they weigh back then. But they're getting tossed around like toys, and this is where they ended up. If you were actually inside these cars while the tornado came along, there are no guarantees you could survive, so you definitely do not want to get into cars. Unfortunately, on Terrible Tuesday, a lot of Wichitans were killed when they got into their cars and tried to escape the tornado. Again, I would encourage you to talk to Mike Campbell. Maybe he can share his story later. As far as taking proper shelter, especially at home, you don't want to go to shelter barefoot. I mean, look at the picture here. Would you want to try to walk through that mess barefoot? And this is what could happen to your home or where you're living in the event of a tornado. You'll want to have a battery-powered radio, a flashlight, a first aid kit. If you have people in your family who rely on prescription medications or glasses, you certainly want to have that stuff in a kit, like a tornado bucket, something like that. And this is probably more for the grown-ups in the family. Work gloves, car keys, form of identification. And one of our students mentioned bottled water. Not only is it important for me as I try to get through our presentation, but it's important to have in your safe shelter. I want to touch quickly on squall lines. A squall line's not something you hear all too often on local weathercasts, but it is something that affects us. They're not quite as significant as tornadoes, but they're larger. They can cover larger areas than tornadoes for sure. They can produce up to EF1 tornado winds, which is anywhere from 70 up to over 100 miles per hour. So they can produce very high winds. This is what we would call straight line winds, whereas tornado winds are rotating, like a vortex type wind. The squall lines often occur overnight between sunset and sunrise. The clouds can look very ominous. They can look very scary coming towards you. That's kind of what they look like top right, and then top right, and then bottom right is how they might appear on the radar, stretching for hundreds of miles in length. They can destroy unanchored mobile homes, and they can have a forward speed of 50 to 70 miles per hour. This is a good reason to have something that could wake you up in the middle of the night in the event that these type of storms were coming your way. I will never forget, I can't remember when specifically it was, but I think it was a Saturday morning. We had a squall line come through where I live in Burke Burnett. I was fast asleep, and I thought the world was exploding. I had never heard a wind or a sound like that in my life. I come to find, Mike, that we had 75 mile per hour winds. It was just this. It's probably one of the scariest weather-related moments of my life for sure. Thank goodness we didn't suffer any significant damage, but all of that came from a squall line that actually got to our neighborhood just before sunrise. Here's some more pictures here of what a squall line might look like. But as I mentioned earlier, they often happen at night, so you may not even be able to see these clouds ahead of a squall line or related to a squall line.
John, we might just take a moment and ask folks if they have any questions. And we'll kind of go in order here in just a few moments. I think we'll go with Archer City, and then Henrietta, and then City View again, and then Mr. Russell as well. So let's just check in with Archer City real quick. If you could unmute and just let us know if you have any questions for Mr. Cameron this morning.
Hey, it's Archer City.
Yes, sir.
Hey, they said we have no questions.
Okay, very good. All right, let's see. Who did I say was next? Let's see. City View.
Okay, yes, we do have a question. I'm going to let my student ask you.
Awesome.
Okay, lean down.
Back in the olden days, what did they use besides radar because they didn't have it?
That is a great question.
Oh, be sure to mute again, please.
Yeah, go ahead and mute for me.
Please.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
go ahead and
Okay,
mute for me.
sorry.
So radar became a reliable way to detect weather after World War II, probably into the late 40s, 50s. It was actually aircraft radar that they started seeing. They started seeing weather on. That's the easy way to say that. And eventually, as we got into the 50s and into the 60s, radar really evolved to become the best way to detect weather, sample weather. Prior to that, it was a little tougher. Often you would, for example, here's a perfect way to say this. Let's say we're in Wichita Falls. I know that some of you are out in other areas, but let's say we're in Wichita Falls. We might rely on folks, say, out in Vernon or Altus to give us a weather report if the skies are looking kind of tough, whether it be telephone or some another like radio, something like that. Before we were able to see weather at any great distances, before radar or satellite, we would often rely on people who have already experienced the weather to alert us as to what might be coming. So you can see how we're quite fortunate to have the technology we have now to see weather that could do us harm, for sure. That's a great question.
All right, let's check in with, I believe, Henrietta. Or was that Henrietta? I can't remember. I've lost track.
I think that was City View.
Okay. How about Henrietta?
Henrietta?
If you could unmute and just check in with us, please.
Does a tornado, like when a tornado hits your house, is that the only thing that destroys it?
That's a good question. What does the most damage is the tornado winds, which are strong enough themselves to do damage, but what really causes significant damage is when those tornado winds have stuff in them. Pieces of fence, pieces of trees, maybe a piece of a car, maybe a piece of your neighbor's house. That can do significant damage. So the wind alone will mess things up for sure. But if that wind has a lot of stuff in it, what we call debris, that can cause that tornado to be do significant damage for sure. That's a great question.
Let's check in with Mr. Russell, please. Mr. Russell, this is your class. Will your class have any questions for Mr. Cameron today?
All right, he's coming up. He's got a question for you.
Very, very good. Awesome.
Go ahead, ask him.
Why tornadoes can be weak or strong?
That's a really good question also. And there's a lot of science involved, a lot of science with big words and math and all that stuff. But the tornado may only be as strong as the thunderstorm that produces it. With tornadoes like the Wichita Falls tornado from Terrible Tuesday, the conditions were just right at all levels of the atmosphere for that tornado to be very well organized and to be very large and to stay on the ground for a long period of time and affect, again, tens of thousands of people. But the weak tornadoes come from relatively weak thunderstorms that are not very well organized, and the conditions for that tornado to exist, again, I'm trying to avoid using any big sciencey words and math and all that, but the conditions for that weak tornado exist may only exist for a few seconds. Therefore, that tornado only exists, it's only on the ground for a few seconds. So it really has everything to do with the atmosphere around that thunderstorm and how much moisture there is, where the winds are turning, and so on and so forth. Again, a fantastic question.
All right. Did we miss anybody? I thought I caught everyone, but did we miss anyone?
And
if you would, just unmute and check in with us. All right, very good. Okay, well, let's go on. We'll be thinking about other questions you might have.
You know, Mike, I think that's...
You're pretty close.
Yeah, this is my last slide. This might be of interest, especially to any of you who might be, any of our staff, faculty who might be my age or older. This is the actual Tornado Watch box that was issued back in April 10th, the afternoon of April 10th, 1979. I think the first tornado actually touched down, I want to say, out by Kroll maybe, and that was about 3:30 in the afternoon, somewhere about there. So not only was this a very timely watch, but I think most of the significant tornadoes that occurred that evening occurred within this box. So I have to say, this was a very good forecast, considering the challenges of forecasting severe weather almost 40 years ago. And I just want to quickly summarize what we talked about today. Yes, the frequency, by frequency, the amount of severe weather that we get is quite high, especially in the month of May. Also, we can see some tough storms in the early part of June. This is just a busy time of the year for thunderstorms. Also, Texoma has its place in history when it comes to severe weather. Obviously, we talked about Terrible Tuesday, April 10th, 1979. The odds are very poor The odds are very poor that you'll ever be affected. The chances are very poor that you'll ever be affected by a violent tornado. Squall lines in most tornadoes are survivable in sturdy buildings, including school buildings, also framed homes. The first line of defense is having your plan and staying informed. And it's with all the technology around us, whether it be televisions or smartphones or you name it. If you say you never saw it coming, then you just weren't paying attention, because it's so easy to stay ahead of the weather nowadays, for sure.
We've got a question.
Okay.
Typed in.
I hope I have an answer.
This is going to be good. In the Griffin classroom over at City View, they say their students want to know, how come a tornado is an F5 versus an F2? What does that mean?
Okay, those numbers, the higher the number, 0 being lowest, 5 being highest, the higher the number, for example, an F5, what that means is when scientists look at the damage that the tornado has done, they have determined that it would take wind speeds, a certain wind speed, to do that damage. Here's another way to say that. I think I do have the EF scale here.
Yeah, go ahead and go back.
Can I escape? Now, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I hadn't freshened my slides here to reflect what we call the EF scale now. Which has been, 10 years or so. But anyway, this is a perfect example. We look at the F5, and we see the damage done by an F5 tornado. Well, the scientists have determined that it would take winds of at least 261 miles per hour to do the damage that they have found. So we're talking about winds moving, a lot faster than NASCARs to do the damage. We go lower to the scale, say F1, and you see that it would take wind speeds anywhere from 73 to 112 miles per hour to do the damage of an F1 tornado. So the higher the number, F5, the greater the damage done, and that the picture here, bottom right, is what an F5 tornado can do, which is literally sweep a foundation clean. The background there is what's left of the home. So thank goodness those are very, very rare tornadoes.
Great question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Certainly, if you want to type it in on the chat, or if you just want to unmute and ask your question, that would be great as well. We'd love to hear from you. We've talked a lot about tornadoes today, but what about lightning? I know that you mentioned that we're a greater chance to be struck by lightning. What do we need to be aware of when it comes to lightning?
Yes. The great thing about lightning is that it's accompanied by thunder, and if we hear thunder, that's kind of a warning sign that some bad weather might be on the way, and it would be a good time to be indoors. Two things that lightning seem to be attracted to is tall objects. How about three things? Tall objects, metal objects, and water, right? We just happen to have a very tall metal object in our backyard at the television station. As you go down Seymour Highway and you go past Channel 3 and Channel 6, you see these 1,000-foot metal towers, and those are constantly getting hit by lightning during thunderstorms. But thank goodness they're well engineered to where they don't cause us any harm. It's pretty fascinating how that happens. But lightning can be dangerous. Obviously, unfortunately it kills a lot of people in the United States.
I guess the important thing is to get indoors.
If
you can hear thunder, you can make a plan to get inside and avoid trees and that sort of thing.
Especially if the thunder is loud, yeah. If you see a flash and then immediately hear thunder, that means that the storm's very close, and it's very important that you get inside.
Do we have any other questions real quick? I know we're kind of getting close here. We've got about, looks like maybe around 10 minutes left.
Okay.
If needed. So we'll be glad to answer questions now, if anyone. Let's start back with Henrietta. We'll check in one time.
The biggest storm that happened in Texas, where did it first hit?
Let me clarify. The biggest tornado? Or
I'm playing Wichita Falls on that one.
Yeah?
Yeah, the biggest tornado.
Okay. Now, as far as the local area, really nothing compares to the tornado that hit Wichita Falls about, 39 years ago. You may have seen my slide where I mentioned that Wichita Falls was the fifth deadliest tornado in Texas history. Number one on that list is Waco. Back in May of 1953, there was a tornado that hit Waco and went right through downtown Waco, if I recall. And where'd my slide go? Anyway, I want to say it killed 115 people.
So certainly more deadly.
Yeah, more deadly for sure. I don't know as far as, amount of damage. But you have to remember, back in the 50s, we just weren't very good. In fact, I don't even think they had such thing as a tornado warning back in 1953. We were close. I think we were doing that maybe by the late 50s. But the worst tornado as far as people we lost in Texas history was Waco. And Wichita Falls came along, I'm bad at math, 15 plus years later, and killed about 45 folks.
Great question. Thank you very much. How about Mr. Johnson class in City View? We'll give you a chance here right now. So.
Yes, we're here. My student has a question.
Yay! Awesome.
Wait, hang on. Are you ready?
Yay! Awesome. Yes.
Okay, get up there.
How fast is a supercell?
Yes.
Ask me that one more time.
Supercell.
Ask me that one more time.
Is a supercell?
How fast is a supercell?
It's a supercell.
Wow. Great question.
Wow. Great.
On
Great
average,
question.
a supercell's forward speed is 35, 40 miles per hour. I would say 30 to 40 miles per hour. Now, the storms I was tracking yesterday morning when we were actually on the air with severe weather, we had some storms that were moving 55, 60 miles per hour. But as far as these well-organized supercell that are almost the size of a Texas county and capable of producing tornadoes, they tend to move, their forward speed tends to be, 35, 40, sometimes as much as 45 miles per hour. Good question. And, of course, that also answers the question, how about the tornado itself? Obviously, the tornado produced by that supercell tends to move at about the same speed.
In the Griffin classroom in City View.
How do you know when that tornadoes are coming and the weather, stuff like that?
How do you know when they're coming? How do you
How do you
predict
know
that? How do you predict that?
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you
Well,
predict when the weather is coming?
this may sound kind of silly, but let's think of a tornado as food. That sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? But what I'm getting at is, in order to get food or something we might eat for dinner, we have to have a recipe made up of ingredients. And what meteorologists look for is they look for the ingredients and see if those ingredients are coming together. A wind from the south brings a lot of warm Gulf moisture into the area. That could be fuel for the development of thunderstorms. What's interesting is let's say the atmosphere is 15 miles deep. We'll just say that. Well, you'll find that near the ground, the wind might be blowing from the south. But as you go up in the atmosphere, that wind might be turning, becoming more southwesterly and then westerly and then maybe even northwesterly as you get to that 14th mile. So literally, if a chunk of air, to use a scientific word, a chunk of air is rising through that atmosphere, it's actually going to be turned by those winds. And we look for that, what we call shear instability, the chunks of air rising rapidly, instability, and that shear. We're looking for the ingredients for that recipe to see if in that environment a storm might develop, and a storm that could develop a tornado. I don't know if that's a legitimate answer or not, but
I like it.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
All right. Finally, let's go with two more. One of them would be Arch City, and we'll check in with Arch City, and let's see if Arch City has any questions for us this morning. We'll give you a moment.
We have a question.
Okay.
How fast does train line wind?
I heard how fast.
How fast does the strain line wind?
Straight line winds.
Great question.
Yes, very good question. So most winds outside of a tornado are in fact straight line winds. We'll go outside this afternoon and we will in fact get straight line winds, but those straight line winds are only about 5 to 10 miles per hour. Everything's fine then, right? What we worry about is thunderstorms that are producing straight line winds that can do damage. And typically those winds have to be going 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. You remember I talked about the squall line earlier. Those squall lines can produce 70, 80 mile per hour winds, and those are strong enough to topple mobile homes and knock over trees and fences and stuff like that. So what we concern ourselves with is those straight line winds moving, from one direction to the next at 50, 60, 70 miles per hour. Those are the ones we have to worry about.
Great question. How about Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell's class.
Go ahead.
My name is Aiden, and how come some weathermen how come some weather people, they put a tornado watch someplace, and instead the tornado goes around the place instead?
Aha. Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, how come the meteorologist or the weather person might say that a storm or tornado is going to hit your town, but it doesn't? It goes a different direction or goes around. It's funny. This is a tremendous question because no matter where I go, whether it be Vernon or Seymour or Lawton or Archer City or Bowie, wherever, people will come up to me and they'll say, John, why is it that it seems like the weather always goes around us? And, sometimes perception is greater than reality. Sometimes we tend to notice the misses more than the hits. Here's the answer I give, and it's short and it's sweet, and I say that is just nature being nature. There are no straight lines in nature. Thunderstorms don't have a direct line that they go down. That is just the unpredictable chaos of nature. And sometimes there's simply not an explanation as to why a storm might miss a town. Now, granted, if we're talking about a tornado, we wouldn't mind it missing the town. But it's a tremendous question.
All right. Any final thoughts here as we wrap things up?
I will encourage, go to your parents, go to the grown-ups you live with and say, where is our safe spot? Can we do a tornado drill at home? Why not? Because the the severe weather is more likely to affect you while you're at home than when you're at school, because those toughest storms, the strongest storms tend to come in the evening, and those are the ones that could produce tornadoes. So I would talk to your parent and say, hey, where's our safe spot? Can we do a tornado drill? I'd like to know. That'd be my final question or thought.
Very good. Yeah. Well, Mr. Cameron, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and thank you all for joining us. I guess the biggest takeaway for me is to be sure to listen to the adults in your family and at school, and whatever they say do that. Don't panic, because all of our schools have very safe places built into them, and we know where to go to keep you guys safe. And the same thing's true at home as well. Well, once again, we want to say thank you all, and hope you all have a great day, and be sure to tune in to Channel 6 and watch Mr. Cameron every morning.
Thank you so much, Mike.
See y'all. Bye-bye.
All right.